History tells us that we've been fishing here in our streams and oceans for thousands of years. But over the last century and a half, more of us with better tools and improved technology are putting a strain on California that we all love. Today, with 38 million Californians, treating our resources wisely is an incredible challenge. Hi, I'm Tom Raftican and welcome to Real World Conservation. The concept behind Real World is simple. We hope to explore solutions to resource challenges that balance our sustainable use of resources while still ensuring a vibrant future for our kids. We'll not only look at fish, but habitat including our oceans, reefs, estuaries, and streams. And in addition to checking out these ecosystems, we'll chat with fishermen and other experts to shed some light on practical solutions that work today and yet serve us well into the future. Join us as we check out some great fishing and real-world conservation.
Howdy, welcome to Real World. Tom Raftican here. We got a really interesting show for you today. We talk about real-world conservation. This is R-E-A-L, real world. How things actually work in our world, in our universe. And conservation, basically the wise use of resources. We're going to talk with Bob Osborn today, and Bob has done an immense amount of work on climate, and not necessarily just climate change, but what are the things that affect climate. Probably over 10 years background on that. Bob, back in real life, was a CPA, and while he's retired and no longer works in that field, he's carried a lot of those same principles into his investigations. We're going to talk about, I got interested because of fishing and the moon and how that affects the tides, but the tides are a really good indicator of where we're going. With that, I want to introduce Bob Osborn. Bob, welcome to Real World.
Oh, thank you. Pleasure to be here.
Good to have you here. And, the moon affects the tides, right?
That's correct.
Tell me a little bit about that.
Well, the tides are a big factor, especially for fishermen, but it has effects on all of us. It's an area that hasn't been heavily researched, and there is some, probably for 100 years, people haven't really paid a whole lot of attention to the tides. And there really is, in this day and age, a real need to pay more attention to how tides affect us. Most of us consider the tides to be the ocean coming in and out twice a day, with the moon going overhead, primarily causing the movement of the tides. But tides go much beyond that.
I think the interesting thing here is, and we've talked about this before, is the fact that the gravitational pull of the moon basically moves our entire oceans, all right, 2/3 of the Earth's surface, up and down twice a day. And, if you picked up a bucket of water, how heavy it is and what it takes to change that. Think about the immense amount of force it takes to move that, and that's what the gravitational pull of the moon does. And that gets into a little bit of the research you've been conducting.
Yes, my research has been pretty much focused on climate change. And I started doing this probably about 15 years ago when climate change started to become a mainstream discussion. And I found that having prior to being a CPA, I'd spent about 14 years in the construction industry and had a real big interest in
solar radiation?
Yeah, solar radiation and passive solar radiation for heating systems that don't use any power. It was something that got started for me back in 1973 when we had the Arab oil embargo. And so I learned quite a bit about that over the years. And then when the climate change issue came up, it was addressing issues like convection and other things that you use in the passive solar industry. And I felt uncomfortable with what they were saying about it. And so I took an interest. I need to understand, I knew what it does in a building, okay? But I didn't know what it does in our atmosphere. So I spent quite a few years trying to learn exactly how they are explaining this works, but actually they don't exactly explain how it works.
Bob, I just remember going back in the conversations with you, and you're going, well, you have convection, and how does this actually make our planet warmer? And it's kind of like we have known laws of physics, and the solutions they're coming up with really don't fit within the known laws of physics.
Well, they're consistent with the laws of physics, but physics doesn't tell us everything about what's going to happen with those laws. And that's why we have experiments, and we use experiments to confirm that our ideas of physics actually meet with the real world. And so this is a matter of contention that is heavily discussed on the blog sphere, back and forth. I've participated in that for about 15 years and tried to learn what everybody's different ideas were, and a great deal of arguing back and forth of what actually works and what doesn't work. And about 15 years ago, I discovered a pattern in the weather data that goes back 160 years, and this pattern was showing up as an acceleration of warming and then a deceleration of warming over a 20-year cycle. And so at the time I was really curious about what could cause that. I wasn't aware of any discussion that was causing that. And there was talk about what they called every decade a step up in temperature. Well, that's related to this because it actually shows up in the data, this decadal effect. And it's not CO2 that's causing that effect, because CO2 is rather steadily increasing.
Right, it would be linear.
It would be linear, yeah, or maybe accelerating a little curve to it or whatever, but it's not steps. And so for quite a while, I kind of just put it aside and didn't think about it for quite a while. And it was just actually this year when all of a sudden we had a great deal of global warming last winter that came way before expected from the El Nino that we're having. And so normally it takes about 90 days or 120 days for the El Nino to have an effect on global temperatures, but this actually coincided with the start of El Nino. And I don't remember how I discovered it, but I found the answer to that 20-year cycle, and it was Jupiter and Saturn. And so Jupiter and Saturn actually causes this 10-year pattern.
For our viewers, we're talking about gravitational pull of the moon moving tides, but what you're talking about is gravitational pull of major planets actually causing an impact on the Earth.
Yes, let me kind of go through this a little bit just briefly here about exactly how gravity works. And so we know about we've already talked about the ocean tides.
Right.
And so when we look at what the moon does, okay, we see that it stretches the planet in two different directions. It's kind of like, the reason that is the moon pulls gravitational, so it pulls more on the water close to the moon, then next on the planet, solid planet itself, and it pulls the least on the backside, so it creates a backside tidal bulge. So you have that high tide occurring twice a day with the revolution of the Earth in one revolution. And so that's kind of the basic, this kind of egg-shaped expansion on both sides is something that it's important to understand about gravity. Anyway, so then here it is how it affects our orbit. Now this is all exaggerated.
Okay.
We're very quite circular with a little bit of this ellipticity to our orbit. But this shows that as the Earth goes around, it gets closer to the sun on this side and further from the sun on this side. And it also passes through this side slower, and it passes through that side fast. And that's because of the return back towards the sun accelerates it. And
this is, although the orbit is not quite circular, it's elliptical.
Right.
But the gravitational pull of other planets is slowing or speeding this up.
And I'll get to that. I'll get to the other planets in a moment here, but I was just trying to give you the general idea of how an orbit works, how the Earth's orbit works, and the orbit of all the planets work in a similar manner. Anyway, so on the next slide, we have actually a NASA article here that points out the eccentricity over time, the pull of gravity from our solar system's two largest gas giant planets, Jupiter and Saturn, causes the shape of the Earth's orbit to vary from nearly circular to slightly elliptical. Now this is important because they're pointing out here Jupiter and Saturn, but there are more planets out there that are having similar but maybe smaller effects than Jupiter and Saturn. And so what we need to do is understand what the total effect is. And so here is one effect that is caused on the orbit, and that's showing the planet in different, this is showing a picture of Jupiter in 4 different positions.
Okay.
Here it's cooling because it's stretching the Earth away from the sun, with that double stretch, okay? When it comes down to this side here, it's roughly equidistant from the sun and the Earth, so there's less stretch in this area. So these areas here cause warming relative to these areas. So that's one variable. And the other variable is how fast the planet travels. And here's a graph showing how that works, okay? So when the planet is over here, gravitational pull is out in the direction of the planet. So where it's going the slowest up here normally, okay, and the fastest down here, as we showed in the previous slide, here it's pulling it faster instead of slow through the cold section of the orbit, and here it's slowing it down as it goes past the sun when it normally goes faster. When it flips over to the other side, it does exactly the opposite.
Okay.
And it accelerates it through the warm section and slows it through the cold section. So this is the second factor of speed and distance, are the 2 factors that are important with gravity.
And these planets move.
Yes, and the planets move. So giving you an example, okay, of planetary position in 2 different years, we had a good deal of warming from 1980 till the present. Well, what has happened here was in 1980, all the planets were grouped over on this side.
On that side of the Earth, correct.
Which is the cool side. Okay, there's some warming here being over in this way here, but cooling from the speed element. And over here, it's all warming, okay? And so this is the way it was here in 2023, 1981 to 2023. And so the difference here has caused, in terms of speed, about 5 days difference in how much time it spends in the cool section versus the warm section. And so that needs to be quantified, and I did a little reasonableness test, and I came up with about 0.6 of a degree warming from that effect, using data from NASA on the difference in insulation you get from the 2 different positions of the planet.
Okay.
So that's a pretty significant amount of warming.
Yeah.
And and so I figured, wow, we need to look at this much closer. This could have a huge effect on our climate. Our climate obviously is not a single factor. We don't really understand what feedback is and what the ultimate degree of warming will be.
Bob, one of the things that we talked about before is that, we're talking about climate change. And, there's a big worldwide push on right now about addressing anthropogenic causes of climate change, and carbon in the atmosphere has been #1 there. In order to determine how much or if that carbon has an impact, don't we really need to know a baseline of how climate normally proceeds?
Yes, absolutely. We can't tell what a new factor would have unless we knew what is actually occurring in the climate at the moment. And so understanding natural change is key to understanding anthropogenic change.
How much energy is spent on looking at the normal climate change right now? You know, you cannot turn on a television, a computer, or hear news anywhere without something about carbon and climate change.
Right.
I mean, they're synonymous right now. They're literally synonymous. How much energy is spent on looking at the natural systemic causes of climate change?
Way too little.
Okay.
Way too little. And in fact, they've pretty much cherry-picked all the things that are causing cooling in the natural system and featured them and completely ignored the things that may be causing warming. And this is one of them. This is the major one here. This one has been understood by scientists for centuries, basically. I mean, it was 100 years ago, a scientist, Serbian scientist named Milankovic, came up with a theory of what causes the ice ages, and it's this here. So that is sold to the public, not by any scientist that I'm aware of. I don't know any study that says this, but it's sold through the press and through the blogosphere that this is a gradual process that takes 100,000 years, and therefore we can ignore it over 100 years because it's only 1,000th of it, you know. But that's absolutely not true. It never has been true. I mean, they're thinking of it like in terms of a clock with one hand.
Mm-hmm.
And so instead of having this one hand go around a 100,000 year clock.
Once every 100,000 years,
right.
We have 9 hands on that clock that are working basically independently. And so once every 100,000 years, they come in concert and this happens.
That's correct, yes. I mean, and it's one of the 3 factors of orbital forcing that causes the ice ages. And this eccentricity is thought by some scientists to be about 50% of it. And so that's much more warming than what we've seen in the last 175 years.
Okay, so I mean, we've looked at this before. When I say we, you and I, basically privately, but you know, 10,000 years ago, we had an ice age here. I mean, there were glaciers here on the North American continent. I mean, that is a dramatic climate change. And, you know, carbon had nothing to do with them appearing or disappearing. Is that correct?
Well, I don't get into carbon that much, you know, in terms of historical carbon. I do know that.
Well, what I'm trying to say is that there are other factors in there that really need examination, and they need investment in that examination so that we actually find out what the baseline is.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, this area right here is I mean, this fellow Milankovic, the Serbian mathematician, did this back in the 1920s, did most of his work on this, discovered it, published in 1926, I believe it was, or somewhere around there. And essentially nothing's been done since. Now, the same thing happened with carbon. It was about over 100 years ago, there was a scientist that started proposing that carbon could affect the climate. And after a couple of tests, they decided, well, maybe not, you know, so it just kind of disappeared from the scene. It no longer was talked about it, but then all of a sudden, you know, 80 years later, everybody's talking about it and everybody's working on it.
It's the silver bullet.
Yeah, and spending billions on it, you know. And so, but nothing has been spent since then on this.
On the follow-up of the Milankovic work. And that was kind of what I was getting around to, is that isn't it time that, and certainly we as a nation, you know, take a serious look at all the things that drive climate change.
Yes,
and this isn't trying to cherry pick one or the other, but saying if you look, instead of investing solely in one of them, which seems to be where we're at right now, with all studies pointing in that direction, how you get them up or down, carbon content up or down, we need to take, my proposal would be take a wider view of this and start investing at least equal amounts of money in these different protocols.
Right. This is actually probably simpler than dealing with carbon, because there are a lot of things we don't understand about carbon. And this here is basic Newtonian physics. And so we can program this. It's a lot of calculations. I mean, it's millions of calculations. And Milankovitch was amazing with what he came up with out using computers. Yeah, 100 years
using
ago.
a pencil, yeah.
Yeah, and what we could do with this in this day and age with computers is night and day difference.
Well, you know, we start talking about this, and all of a sudden you realize that there are 8 and probably 9 planets floating around in our solar system, and each one has, you know, we go around the sun once a year. That's it. You know, one rotation. That's 1 year. What other rotations of the other planets, and you know, how much does this fit in?
Well, the 4 planets that have what you might call a climate length type rotation, where they could actually apply gravity for a long period of time for each time the Earth goes around. That is we have Jupiter is the largest planet out there, and it has a 12-year orbit period, and then Saturn has a 30-year, Uranus has an 84-year, and Neptune has 165 years. And so it's very rarely that these things get into the same place in the sky. I've been working on cycles. Saturn and Jupiter have about a 900-year cycle where they're in the warm side predominantly, then they can move a little bit out of it. It marches each 60 years. Its conjunctions move only about 8 degrees in the sky. So to move a good distance in the sky, you need a few hundred years. The whole cycle is about 800 years.
Doesn't this sound a lot more like what the world has experienced as far as climate goes over the millions of years that we've been here?
Right. And if we look back at the ice core data, I have a graph here that was done by a group that shows the temperature fluctuations on a scale over here, which you can see on degrees centigrade, that a lot of these that these temperatures are varying from 2 to 4 degrees for each one of these peaks that they have here. So they have peaks that are roughly in time with the Jupiter-Saturn cycle.
I noticed that you have, you know, you've tied the two together, not.
Right. So I came up with Milankovitch actually came up with a cycle that was 2,500 years, which is how often that the 4 planets would meet in the sky. I came up with one with 3,500 years of where they meet in the sky in a certain area and how often they do that. And they'll do that for a while, and then they'll completely move out of that area for a long period of time.
Okay.
And when they move out of that area for a long period of time, that's probably what creates the ice ages. Okay. We're in the pattern when they are 3,500 years apart, with the green lines that I show here, an explanation of what each one of those lines mean, and when that occurs, we can see that this peak's not drawn yet. On here we only have 2007, but 2023 is up in this area. Okay. And so
we're approaching peaks that were actually here 2,000 years ago.
Yeah, 3,400 years, 500 years ago was what they called the Minoan period of Greece.
Okay.
And that was supposed to be one of the warmest periods of time. Then you go back another 3,500 years and you get another peak that's about 7,000 years ago.
And these are ice ages.
This is not the ice age, this is just all the Holocene here.
Oh, okay.
Over here is where it came out of the ice age down here over 10,000 years ago. And so that's not on this graph.
Okay.
But
you need a bigger graph.
Right. Well, yeah, if you want to see the whole process, you need a bigger graph.
But this lays it out pretty well.
Yeah, this lays it out. And if you go with a bigger graph, you can see how these cycles might change over time. So, I mean, there are a lot of calculations here in determining what the actual temperature effect is. I've done a reasonableness test on it based on taking rough ideas of the gravitational effect on speed that the planets could have at a maximum, and I've come up with some pretty big warming numbers. Now, I'm not going to sit here and say that they're correct. They're probably near maximum, what the potential is. But if the potential is that high, we should be looking at it.
Well, and again, it just seems the maximum amount of dollars spent on research right now is on one narrow factor. And unfortunately, media jumps on that one narrow factor and paints it as the total picture.
Right, and if you want to see, actually we have what this whole elliptical cycle causes. We have this from NASA. When the Earth's orbit is its most elliptic, about 23% more incoming solar radiation reaches Earth at our planet's closest approach to the Sun each year than it does at the furthest departure from the Sun.
That's NASA.
That's NASA. And so we know it's a big number. And it's a number that this is just the ellipticity of it. How long it stays that elliptic is really the issue of the patterns of over the 100,000 years that create the ice ages.
And NASA has, I mean, when rockets go, when we send rockets to other planets, they use the intermediate planets basically as slingshots to get around.
Right.
So if you can do the calculations on that, some of this stuff really should be almost child's play.
Right. NASA did the Voyager series of spacecraft back in the 1970s, and they took advantage of a alignment of the planets that they said only occurs once every 175 years, and used it to slingshot from one planet to the next, and they visited all four gas giants in less time than it would have taken them just to send a probe to Neptune.
We've got about a minute left. Is there anything else you want to leave us with?
Well, yeah, let me go to the last slide here. Okay, this is Milankovitch's work. Okay, and it shows different orbital variation theory. Here's the 100,000 year. Here's a couple of the smaller ones that are dealing with the tilt of the axis, and there's this little oddity right here at 2,500 years. That happens to add up to when all four planets meet in the sky.
So we've got some pretty compelling evidence that this is a key.
Yes.
Bob Osborn, tremendous research you've done. Thank you so much for being on Real World Conservation. This is a good push in the right direction.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Right about now,
you choose. Want to be a fisherman and wear me father's shoes. You've got to be a crazy man if this is the life you choose. Is this the life you choose? Oh, this is the life I choose.